What's up, y'all? Welcome back to let me get this in. The Onyx Report, Black Masculinist news for the day. Hope you're well. I was asked to take a look at something, kind of on the spot. This is apparently a conversation that rapper Ace Hood had with his mother. It was sent to me from the Love Dorsey channel. Shout out to her. I appreciate her work. So let's go ahead and check it out. Okay, come on.
We're going to kind of go back to a little situation, that happened between me and you.
Yeah.
And we never had got into it.
Yeah.
When you was talking to me on the phone and you was snappy with me, and when I hung up that phone, I sat in that parking lot, I cried for an hour.
Right at that space of me transitioning to being an independent artist, my mom could express how unsupported she feels. I've been taking care of my mother for a decade plus. I've got her the cars, I've got her the house. And I think getting into a point to where things started to look different for me because I was no longer on a scale of being in a major label. Now I had to learn, well, what does this independent life look like, including my finances? So it was a huge point of misunderstanding for her, and we disconnected for some time.
You had hurt me so bad with some of the things you said to me.
I had to create some healthy boundaries between me, finances, and my family.
I am your mother. But to drop me cold, I was angry. I just felt like I was your...
Okay, so let me first start out by saying I'm not familiar with Ace Hood, but I give props to him straight out for being able to construct boundaries. Just even saying that is extremely profound. And the most difficult thing for most black men to do, especially if they're single mother raised, is to establish boundaries with their mothers, right? So shout out to him for that. Early on, and this is only a 2-minute clip, but one of the things we can see already is that she's using emotionally manipulative tactics to control him. When she started out by saying she cried for an hour, that's an emotionally manipulative tactic, right? That works especially on young boys. He handled it with nothing but grace. He just looked at her, didn't give her a response. He didn't give her negativity. He didn't give her positivity. He just stayed neutral energetically, which was beautifully done. And she's still going back in a way, trying to emotionally manipulate him, and he's not allowing it. But he's doing so in a respectful manner. So let's see what else he does.
All in all, I was your queen. But when Sheila became a part of, I felt like everything changed.
I feel like a lot of black...
Okay, I'm going to go back a little bit because that was an extremely important part right there. I didn't mean to cut into where she talks about, I was your queen. This is deep.
I was your queen. But when Sheila became a part of, I felt like I'm your mother. But to drop me cold, I was angry. I just felt like I was your all in all. I was your queen. But when Sheila became a part of, I felt like everything changed.
I feel like a lot of black men, black mother relationships stem like that in a way to where it's not fully healthy.
Not to judge anyone, but I felt like she had a lot to do with your decision.
It was solely about survival because the finances weren't the same. In my midst of going independent, that means I'm in a position now to where I got to be able to support myself and support my wife and my children. And, Mom was a little threatened because for her, it looks like a woman that's coming in that's kind of dethroning her from being the queen.
I felt like she pulled you away from me.
Everybody, people, I would never make an excuse for her, but also have to protect my wife.
Right.
She brings me joy. She brings me love. It's like people are supposed to be excited about this.
Okay. Now, obviously the competition between the mother and the wife, that's a thing. And you can find that in a lot of different cultures where there's that overall tension, right? The shift of attention from a young son to his new wife and the tensions that, new wives and mothers go through. I get it. That's going to be kind of present. But she has a different level of investment in this tension because she has relied on her son to provide for her, not only financially, but you get the impression that he's also providing for her emotionally. And this is something that we tend to see, especially in contexts where families are single mother raised. Now, I don't know. I haven't followed Ace Hood. I don't know his story. I don't know if he's single mother raised, but I can definitely say the dynamic is such, even right here in this conversation, you could see it. And one of the other interesting things I noticed is he clearly made a decision and he let her know, I'm setting healthy boundaries. Her first response was, your wife put you up to this. Now that's interesting. And part of why I say it's interesting is really because it comes out of living in a gynocracy. In other words, the Black community is structured in such a way where our women, do run our families. It is what it is. And so in doing so, it never dawned on her that her son made an independent decision as a man about something that he knows will make his life more peaceful. Never dawned on her. Her thought was, you only did this because that woman told you to. In other words, she reduced his life to the competition between her and another woman's authority. Never dawned on her that he had his own sense of authority, his own sense of what his life should be like, and that he may make this decision with or without a wife. But if he chooses to do so, partially inspired by being married, that's not still the same thing as your wife telling you to do it. It can very well be you're establishing, as he put it, healthy boundaries because you recognize the importance of what should be happening in your family, in your household, and whatnot, right? So in other words, when you make life decisions like getting married, or even something like buying a house, sometimes your relationships with other family members need to change and you need to establish new boundaries. But if you're in a family structure that is gynocratic, where the idea of you being a fully agential human being, you have an agency, is not recognized because you're a man. This is part of the impact of the gynocracy we talk about, right? Because he now has to deal with her in terms of his decision while she's ignoring him entirely, other than to emotionally manipulate him, as she's dealing with the other woman as two authority figures bantering over an objectified entity, him. That's kind of some of the tension we're seeing. Let's check the last part.
Type of stuff.
Right.
Let's take ourselves and get into her shoes. Recently, we had a miscarriage. She took it very hard.
I didn't know, and I apologize. Maybe I wouldn't even, brought that up if she would have seen you. We're going to kind of go back to a little situation,
Hey, I don't know what it is. These little clips be starting over. So here's the thing we recognize. He brought up he and his wife's, the loss of a baby, right? And he didn't seem to do so out of a desire to emotionally manipulate him, but he did do so as an explanation of part of what inspired the shift. Now, it is possible that he doesn't see himself as an agent in his own life. Maybe he was only motivated by his wife. I look at it a little interesting that was his first statement to her about why he made his decision. But either way, even if it was inspired by what he experienced, her obliviousness to his decisions being made on his behalf is part of the issue I have with this, because it goes into how men and women are socialized. She's socialized to take authority and see herself and other Black women as the sole figures in a Black community, even in the family setting. And he's been socialized to accept this. Now he challenges it, but to what extent he's interested in establishing his own boundaries for the sake of doing so, or for the sake of his wife, I don't know. It's not that one is necessarily bad. But at the end of the day, I would pose this to you watching this video. Are you able to make these types of decisions independent of another woman outside of your mother? Can you make these decisions because they need to be made, whether you're single or whether you're married with 5 kids, whether you've been married for 3 decades or you've never been married? Can you establish boundaries, most particularly with women? And why is that so important, especially for Black men? Well, it's important because we grow up in a context, like I said before, where men are in many ways considered objects. They're considered property. They're considered tools for sexual gratification, for reproduction, for provisioning and protecting. But a lot of those services are not reciprocated. We have a one-way traditionalism in our community, right? Where to ask for traditional male responsibilities that, we've heard about popularized in the 1950s is par for the course. But for men to ask for those in return, that's inherently a sexist, misogynist request, right? So we have a one-way traditionalism in our community that prioritizes women's needs, interests, and worldview so much as that worldview is female centered. So in that respect, I applaud Ace Hood's willingness to stand his ground and to be clear. And I like the way he handled it. Very smooth, non-confrontational. I mean, everything doesn't have to be confrontational to establish boundaries. I would have preferred it be done simply because it was something he decided. And it's not to say he didn't. To what extent she may have been right or wrong about how much his wife's influence had on the situation, I don't know. But I would tell you, I'm interested in seeing Black men establish for themselves what's necessary in their lives and reestablish relationships. And when I say reestablish, really it's kind of I would say a tuning of a relationship. You're fine tuning it to a better degree, a higher frequency. And you're perfectly willing to walk away if the person in question refuses to acknowledge the boundaries that you're establishing. But at the end of the day, you don't establish these boundaries to be hurtful, to be spiteful, to be any of that. And definitely not because you're controlled by another person. You establish boundaries because it's a decision that you've made after weighing, right, the reality of what you're experiencing over the reality you want to create. And after doing so, standing on that like a rock, whatever that decision is for you, and letting people know these are the new boundaries that I'm setting. And it doesn't have to be just with our mothers. It's just that those relationships tend to be the most difficult to establish boundaries with because the way boys in particular in the Black community are socialized. This notion of son husbands is a reality. And part of that goes back to the era, especially in the 1970s and 1980s in particular. It really comes into fruition in the 80s, where Black men, in many ways, were told by many Black women that they weren't needed. First of all, they were told they weren't much to, they weren't shit to begin with, which was the colloquial way of putting it. But then they were essentially told they weren't needed. They were replaced by state resources. They were replaced by college access, middle class access through white collar employment. Right? These transitions that we saw take place in society, the way they impacted the Black community, was women by and large began to, really experience a major shift in the type of quality of life, even if only symbolically so. What do I mean? Well, pay increase transitioning into white collar employment doesn't always have to be dramatic. It can be subtle, but along with it, there was a lifestyle shift, right? A shift to more middle class views. And an idea that Black men could not provide it, could not participate in it, and were inherently a problem for Black women trying to attain it. Right? So this tension between many Black women and men began to really set root in the 1980s. And I think what we're seeing here is the fallout of that, because many of those women began to develop a resentment toward men, and began to feel that if they couldn't find men, that they'd do two things. They'd piecemeal a variety of men together. Right? That's if she didn't cut off men altogether, but one man for sex, another man for material resources, another man for help with fixing things, really began to piecemeal, kind of Frankenstein, a number of men together in her life. That's the first thing many did. If they didn't, as I said, walk away from men altogether and just shut down. And the second thing they did is they sought to make their sons the men that they wanted. And on the surface, that doesn't sound like a problem, right? The problem with it is what that tends to come with that nobody talks about is it also came with an emotional drain. In other words, she established early on in the man she was making in her son that he provide her the emotional energy that a grown man generally provides in a relationship. This is why she's so frustrated, because he shifted that energy from her to his wife. It made her jealous and it made her resentful, not only of his decision, but of his wife. Well, part of the competition, part of the resentment, part of the frustration is that she was pulling energy from her son in a dysfunctional manner from the first place. The type of attention she sought from her son is generally the attention that she should be seeking from her partner. And the extent to which many women began to step away from either having partners or taking partners seriously and putting that energy into the sons they were building up to become the men that they didn't have. It's part of the problem. Now, when you add in success on his part, it further adds another dimension, right? He becomes even more man she's always wanted. And so another woman becomes an inherent threat to that attention. And so she's left with tools like emotional manipulation, which are far more impactful than from a girlfriend or a wife, because this is the woman that's raised you from birth, right? That's literally fed you from her body, right? That's the intensity of the relationship between the mother and son. But when that mother and son relationship is impacted by dysfunction in an emotionally manipulative way from childhood on, it can be extremely difficult for men to even recognize it, let alone have the personal well-being, the personal strength to challenge it. And I would argue that in this day and age, that's going to be the journey of every man, to be able to step away from your mother and become your own man. But it's particularly difficult if you're raised in a single parent household, especially if you have a mother that has been pulling the energy she would normally seek from relationships and grown men and pulling it from her son. And this can start as young as, in elementary school. I've seen that kind of dynamic take place, where young boys were expected to provide a certain type of emotional presence for their mothers that really would used to only be reserved for grown men. Whether it was sitting and listening to conversations that were inappropriate, or asking for some type of affection. And you know what? It's Oedipal energetically. It doesn't necessarily have to be sexual. It doesn't have to become an incestuous sexual act, but it does in certain instances. It can cross and breach that line. A number of years ago, I had Delroy Lino, the actor, come to my campus, and I created an event all around his visit. Matter of fact, I did a number of them. I brought black male celebrities to the campus and interviewed them about how they got there. And the purpose was very different from my current work. I mean, the purpose at that point was to let my students know that if you want to be famous in 15 minutes, everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame. These are people who have achieved fame and put in decades to get their fame. I'm not saying Lindo or anybody else I brought was only famous for 15 minutes, but the idea was that if you wanted to be famous, you had to put in the work. And I did that by bringing in people to talk about how they got where they were. So anyway, I brought Delroy Lino, and one of the things, I interviewed him on stage in front of about 500 people, and I played film clips from a variety of his films and talked about and asked him questions about those roles and what he did to prepare and so on and so forth. We got to a film he did called Cider House Rules. And in that film, he played a father that was in an incestuous relationship with his own daughter. Right? And to the degree that he got his daughter pregnant, his daughter was played by Erykah Badu in the film. And I asked him, I said, how did you prepare for this kind of role? I mean, and really low key, why'd you play it? Like, was this going to be a problem? And he said, well, I decided to interview psychologists who have dealt with patients who've done this kind of thing. And he said something that I thought was profoundly interesting. He said, part of what, the psychologist I interviewed said about this is when a parent loves too much. When they love too much and they no longer notice the boundaries, they no longer observe the boundaries between parent and child. And what I would add to that is when their own emotional needs become a greater priority than what's the healthiest for a child. I think we have a lot of this in the Black community, and it goes, we don't discuss it publicly, obviously. We just discuss it in individual settings, very choice individual settings, especially for Black men. And much of the time we don't talk about sexual trauma we've experienced. Women have been conditioned to, but that only started really in the 1960s. We really haven't had a movement where men have been conditioned to talk about or even recognize their sexual trauma. We don't. I know when, people discuss black male sexual trauma, they always dismiss it as, well, black men enjoy it, or they high five each other. That's not entirely true across the board. That's just something we say to deflect from having to deal with the realities of it. The real point is, we've not been welcomed to or conditioned to talk about our sexual trauma as something that's valid and important and traumatic. We're not. We're not conditioned to do that. We're not taught that our voices are received, our experiences are welcome. We're not taught any of that. We're taught two things. Either we celebrate it or we ignore it. And then we're told that because we're Neanderthals and men, we're incapable of expressing ourselves, that the trauma is, the onus of that trauma is on us. No. And when men do share it, what's the response by the larger society? Silence. Or ridicule, if you watch social media. Right? Men who experience some type of sexual trauma, even if it's in the moment, even if they're video recorded, going through various types of sexual trauma, it's ridiculed. I posted a video not long ago on my Facebook page of a man who's, I guess they're at a hotel, on the little walkway balcony, where it's being recorded, and this woman, is attacking him. He's naked, he's on the floor, and she's threatening to pull his penis off. In the comments, ridicule and laughter. Right? This is how black male sexual trauma is dealt with. It's dismissed. So when that trauma comes from one's mother, there's no conversation for that. Because making sure we don't embarrass the gynocrats, the gynocratic family leaders, it takes more priority than actually acknowledging what black men experience. And what you'll find, if we do ever delve into it as a collective, is that black males experience every bit as much sexual trauma and otherwise as black women. And may even experience more, since there's no social check against it. In other words, it's not considered, it's taboo. But because there's really no conversation around what black men experience, it can occur. It can occur. How do we know? Well, okay. If there's even the slightest signs, for example, like if you talk about a high school, there's the slightest sign that a male teacher may be interested sexually in his students, his female students. People are primed for that. People are aware of that. If there's any indication, even the slightest bit of flirting, there are people on guard who are already looking for that to make sure they become a problem for him, even before he may do something. But if you have a female teacher who's flirting with her male students, is there any such attention? Are other female teachers and administrators, let alone males, primed for that, noticing it and then calling her out on it publicly before anything happens? No, because we're not having a social conversation. We're not having a large-scale conversation about the impact of that type of sexual exploitation. But when we come back to the mothers, if we're not doing that for teachers, do you really think we're doing that for mothers? But here's the thing. It doesn't have to be traumatic just because it got to a sexual level. Clearly, that's an extreme. What I'm actually more concerned about is what we saw in this video. The type of Oedipal tension that I'm talking about, like the story of Oedipus, the sexual tension I'm talking about, need not necessarily evolve into the extreme of actual sex in order for it to be highly problematic. It is at its base dysfunctional. And it is exploitive emotionally and can damage a lot of boys into their manhood, where they don't even know they need therapy beyond it, but may find their relationships to be, consistently, unsuccessful and not know why. All on a regular basis, having their mothers pull on them energetically to provide for them the attention that she would normally get from a man. But again, since many women were conditioned as far back as the late 70s and 80s to not need a man, or at least believe they didn't need one, provide undue stress on their own male loved ones with very limited conversation about it. So I thought this video was a good example of that. I'm curious to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section. And I hope you guys have a good one. Peace.
Yeah.